Leave the operational stuff to the operators, Commander. The words hung in the air, dismissive, almost mocking. Elara Whitmore lowered her eyes, pen moving in steady silence. No protest, no defense, only the calm strength of someone who knew silence could speak louder than argument. But hours later, as the mission unraveled, ambushes springing, comms failing, units falling into chaos, the door opened. Rear Admiral Jonathan Stroud entered without ceremony. He said nothing, just access to terminal, and with a few keystrokes, her classified file filled the screen. Operations blacked out on every official record, except here. Every officer froze, breathless, as one name glowed back at them. Elara Whitmore, the quiet woman they ignored, was the only one who could save them. The fluorescent lights of the secure conference room at Coronado hummed faintly, washing the room in a cold, bluish tone that seemed to exaggerate the tension in the air. The long oak table was already crowded with uniforms of every shade. SEALs in their sharp navy blues, Marines in crisp service greens, and a handful of Air Force officers, their silver wings gleaming under the lights. Maps were scattered across the table, steaming coffee cups balanced precariously on their edges, and the low murmur of conversation filled the space. Into this scene walked Lieutenant Commander Elara Whitmore. Her steps were quiet, almost imperceptible against the polished floor. No heads turned, no conversations paused. She slipped into a chair halfway down the table, deliberately chosen, not at the head where authority sat, nor at the back where irrelevance lingered, but in that in-between place where she could see everyone without inviting attention. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture straight, but nothing about her demanded notice. To most of the men in that room, she was just another intel officer, a support role, a background presence. At the far end of the table, Lieutenant Ethan Vance leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in the hierarchy. A SEAL with a jawline that could have been carved for a recruitment poster, he radiated the kind of energy that filled a room. Beside him, Captain Daniel Rourke of the Marines spread his maps across the table with bold, sweeping gestures, narrating his plan as if the operation were already a guaranteed success. The two traded words like teammates in a sport they'd already won, their voices carrying effortlessly, commanding the air. Elara listened. She always listened. Her pen moved across her notebook in neat, precise strokes, dates, times, tidal patterns, moon cycles. She noted the terrain features, the bluffs that overlooked the landing zone, the forecast of cloud cover. Patterns that others overlooked jumped at her like signals on a screen. She waited for a pause, then raised her voice just enough to be heard. "Sir, based on the satellite windows, infiltration under full moon conditions will give the opposing force clear visibility from those ridges. I'd recommend—" Rourke didn't even look up. "We've got night vision, Commander. Moonlight's not going to slow us down." A few chuckles rippled around the table. Vance added, smirking, "Intel types always worry about shadows. Operators manage." Her words dissolved into the hum of the room. Elara simply nodded, made another note in her book, and let the silence swallow her. No protest, no pushback. She had learned long ago that arguing in these rooms was rarely about facts. It was about egos. 20 minutes later, when the briefing turned to extraction timing, she tried again. "Sir, if we're working on a 30-minute window, the tide tables show—" "Commander," Vance interrupted smoothly, his tone laced with patient condescension. "We've been doing beach insertions since before GPS. The tide isn't going to stop us." More nods, more easy confidence. Elara closed her notebook halfway, her face calm, unreadable. But her pen moved again, sketching alternate extraction routes that nobody else would bother considering. When the topic shifted to communications protocols, she made one last attempt. "Given the terrain and the electronic warfare environment, I recommend contingency channels outside." "Comms are covered," Rourke cut in without lifting his eyes from the map. "We've got redundancies." And with that, she was dismissed again. This time, not even with mockery, just indifference. A wall of disregard stronger than any spoken word. What happened in that room is not unique to the military. It's something we see in boardrooms, classrooms, and even family gatherings. The phenomenon has a name: groupthink. When confident voices dominate, quieter ones are sidelined, not because their ideas lack merit, but because they lack volume. Humans are wired to follow authority and charisma. A strong jawline, a loud voice, or a confident smirk can outweigh logic, data, and foresight. Elara's silence was not weakness. It was discipline. She knew that arguing at that table would not change minds. It would only harden egos. This is something remarkable about truly experienced people. They understand when their words will matter and when silence will say more. In life, how often do we do the same as Vance and Rourke? Dismissing someone because they don't look the part or because their tone isn't as forceful as ours. How many mistakes could be avoided if we paused, even briefly, to weigh the quiet input in the room? History gives us countless examples of ignored warnings. The engineer who flagged O-ring failures before the Challenger explosion, the analysts who saw patterns before 9/11, the scientists who predicted pandemics years before they unfolded. In each case, the warnings were clear, but drowned out by louder, more confident voices who believed failure was impossible. At that moment in Coronado, Elara Whitmore embodied that timeless figure, the quiet professional, underestimated, overlooked, but quietly preparing for the moment when reality would catch up to arrogance. The first night of the exercise unfolded under a thin crescent moon. The Pacific air was heavy with salt and anticipation as rigid boats cut across the water, carrying SEAL teams toward the shoreline. From the command center, glowing monitors painted the walls in hues of green and red. Digital icons crawled across the map, blue for friendly units, red for opposing force. Elara Whitmore sat at her assigned terminal, headset snug against her ear, eyes locked on the shifting patterns. To anyone watching, she was just another intelligence officer monitoring feeds, routine and mechanical. But she wasn't watching the screens the same way others did. She saw connections, patterns, anomalies, fragments that formed a larger picture no one else cared to piece together. At first, everything appeared routine. SEAL 1 reported landfall. Marine elements began their insertion routes, their comms clear, voices steady. Drones painted ghostly outlines of structures on the shoreline. Rourke and Vance's plans seemed to be unfolding as promised. The operators in the room exchanged satisfied glances, silent confirmation that their instincts had been right. But then the first cracks appeared. Static bled into the Air Force ISR channel. Air 2, your signal's breaking up, Elara called evenly into the net. The reply came back strained, distorted. Copy command, experiencing heavy interference. Possible electronic warfare simulation. Her pen moved across her notebook. This was exactly what she had warned them about. Compromised comms in a contested environment. Still, no one turned toward her. The officers at the head of the table leaned closer to their screens, frowning, but silent. Then the red icons moved. At first subtly, then in deliberate arcs, sweeping toward the very route Rourke had insisted was safe. The ambush was textbook. Overlapping fields of fire, kill zones funneled into natural choke points. Marine 1, hold position and shift south, Elara keyed in. Her tone never wavered. You've got enemy elements moving to cut you off. The reply came from Captain Rourke himself, voice sharp. Negative, command. We push as planned. Marines don't stop mid-stride. And then the shooting started. Even through the command center's insulation, faint pops of simulated gunfire filtered through the comms. On the monitors, red casualty markers lit up. One Marine down, then another. Within 90 seconds, 6 Marines had been killed in the exercise. The room shifted, jokes died, coffee cups were set down. Officers leaned forward, tension snapping the air taut. SEAL 2 moved to reinforce, but the red icons had anticipated it. A secondary ambush snapped shut, cutting off their approach. Radio chatter spiked in panic. SEAL 2 is down! SEAL 2 is down! 2 SEAL operators gone. In under 2 minutes, the exercise had bled 8 casualties. If this had been real, headlines would have screamed disaster. Careers would have ended. Families would have been shattered. Elara sat in silence, pen still scratching. Her notes weren't frantic. They were precise. She had seen this coming, and the notebook in front of her was proof. But no one had wanted to listen. What happened in that command center was more than a fictional training failure. It mirrors a recurring tragedy in human history, the silencing of those who see what others cannot or will not acknowledge. Think of the Challenger space shuttle in 1986. Engineers at Morton Thiokol warned about the O-ring seals failing in cold temperatures. Their warnings were explicit, documented, and desperate. But under pressure to launch, NASA leaders dismissed them. The shuttle exploded 73 seconds after liftoff, killing 7 astronauts. The warning had been there, but louder voices and institutional pride drowned it out. Or take September 11, 2001. Declassified reports later revealed that intelligence analysts had flagged unusual flight training activities and hinted at al-Qaeda plots involving aircraft. Those dots were visible, but decision makers at the top didn't connect them or didn't want to disrupt the status quo. The cost was nearly 3,000 lives in a single morning. The lesson is brutal. Arrogance amplifies blindness. When warnings threaten ego, they are ignored, and the price is always measured in lives. In the Coronado exercise, Elara's role was not to be the loudest voice. She wasn't built like Rourke or charismatic like Vance. Her power was in observation, in connecting data points. But her quiet professionalism was dismissed because it didn't roar with bravado. And this isn't just military culture. It's everywhere. In corporate boardrooms, the intern who hesitates to speak up may already know the customer base better than the executives. In classrooms, the quiet student may have seen the flaw in the group project plan long before it collapses. In families, the child's simple observation, ignored by adults, can sometimes prevent disaster. The danger of ignoring quiet voices is not just tactical, it is existential. Back in the command center, silence grew heavy. No one laughed now. The once confident voices of Vance and Rourke had hardened, tight with strain. Casualty reports scrolled endlessly across the monitors. The scoreboard, designed to gamify the exercise, now glowed red with failure. And through it all, Elara Whitmore remained steady. She didn't gloat. She didn't throw accusations. She simply continued writing, recording each misstep, each ambush, each preventable loss. Not because she needed to prove she had been right, but because she knew someone, someday, would need those notes to survive the real thing. It is a haunting truth. Sometimes the person we ignore the most is the only one who can save us. The command center buzzed with a nervous energy that bordered on collapse. Red casualty markers blinked furiously across the monitors. Radios spat fragments of broken transmissions. Officers leaned in close to their screens, whispering as though proximity could undo disaster. The room smelled of stale coffee and fraying confidence. And then the door opened. No knock, no warning. Just the sound of reinforced hinges moving under deliberate force. Rear Admiral Jonathan Stroud stepped inside, his presence altering the entire rhythm of the room. He didn't need to demand attention. He was attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, Stroud's uniform looked pressed by the weight of precision itself. His ribbon sat perfectly aligned, yet he carried no unnecessary decoration. His silence was sharper than any voice in the room. Officers who had been murmuring went quiet. Chairs straightened. The command center's chaos was suddenly contained, not by order, but by presence. Captain Adrian Cole scrambled to greet him. "Admiral Stroud, sir, we weren't expecting you tonight." "I got word I should be here," Stroud said evenly, scanning the glowing screens. His tone was calm, but calm in the way a storm is calm before it hits shore. His eyes swept over the casualty indicators, the red bleeding across what was meant to be a routine joint exercise. Then he looked at Elara Whitmore. "Why isn't she running the floor?" The words hit harder than a reprimand. Heads turned instinctively toward Elara, then away just as quickly. She sat where she had been all along, quiet, precise, her notebook open, pen aligned perfectly against the margin. Cole cleared his throat. "Commander Whitmore is assigned in an intelligence support capacity, Admiral. Communications oversight." Stroud repeated the words slowly, like tasting something bitter. Intelligence support, communications oversight. He let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then he moved toward the line of secure terminals. "Vacate that seat," he told a technician. The sailor leapt to his feet. Stroud sat down and began typing. Layers of access codes cascaded across the screen. For a moment, only the rhythmic clicking of keys filled the room. Then the black bars of redacted files dissolved and a new dossier came into focus. Lieutenant Commander Elara Whitmore. The room leaned forward. Mission reports, photographs, commendations. Every one of them marked classified in bold red. Details that had been erased from her public record now glowed with the undeniable weight of truth. Operation Scorpion's Gate, Somalia, 2019, Stroud read aloud. 48 hours in hostile territory. No air support. She identified a secondary extraction route when the primary was compromised. Saved an entire SEAL platoon. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few SEAL officers exchanged startled glances. They had heard rumors about Scorpion's Gate. Now the ghost had a name. Stroud scrolled further. Operation Glass Mountain, Syria, 2020. Enemy positions reconstructed from radio intercepts alone. The mission would have collapsed without her analysis. His eyes lifted from the screen. How many lives were saved that night? You don't remember because you weren't told. But she does. More entries appeared. Yemen, North Africa, the Pacific. Each one sealed behind classification. Each one proof of the same truth. The woman they ignored had been carrying lives on her shoulders for years. Stroud turned to the room. Tell me, when she warns you about moonlight exposing your flank or tides complicating your extraction, do you dismiss her because you think she's wrong? Or because you can't stand that she's right? The silence was suffocating. Vance shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado gone. Rourke clenched his jaw, refusing to meet Alara's eyes. The weight of Stroud's question pressed down like gravity. Elara herself remained unchanged. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply sat with quiet composure, as if none of this surprised her. The pen still rested across her notebook, a soldier's calm in the middle of chaos. What Stroud revealed wasn't just about one woman. It was about a truth that threads through every battlefield and boardroom. The most capable people are often the least recognized. Their work is buried in secrecy, overshadowed by louder voices, or dismissed because it doesn't look like power. Elara's silence was not passivity, it was discipline. She had learned long ago that arguing with egos in a briefing room was wasted oxygen. Results would speak louder. And they had, across Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and beyond. History is filled with these invisible guardians. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park who cracked Enigma but couldn't tell the world for decades. The engineers who warned about Challenger's O-rings but were drowned out by launch deadlines. Intelligence officers who prevented attacks the public will never know about. Humility is not weakness, it is strength. And Stroud, by unlocking her file, reminded everyone that silent professionals like Elara save lives not with volume, but with vision. Back at the console, Stroud tapped a final key. The classified records collapsed into black bars once more. The evidence was erased. The screen returned to its sanitized version as though nothing had ever been revealed. But the officers had seen, and seeing was enough. Stroud rose from the chair, his eyes finding Elara's again. Permission to run the floor, Commander? For the first time all day, the room looked to her. Every officer, every branch, waiting. Elara set her pen down with deliberate calm. Yes, Admiral. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted completely. The quiet woman they had ignored was no longer background. She was the fulcrum on which the mission would turn. The exercise was still bleeding red. But with Elara at the center, hope flickered where arrogance had failed. The hum of machines filled the command center as Admiral Stroud stepped back from the terminal. His words still echoed in the silence. Permission to run the floor, Commander? Every head turned toward Elara Whitmore. The woman they had ignored all morning now carried the weight of the operation in her calm, steady gaze. She didn't hesitate. With deliberate precision, she set her pen aside and rose. Yes, Admiral. Stroud nodded once. No further words were needed. The authority had shifted. Elara slid into the central console. Her hands moved confidently across the controls, linking feeds, opening encrypted channels, drawing every thread of the fractured operation into her view. The chaos on the monitors didn't rattle her. Instead, it focused her. Marine 1, her voice cut through the comms, calm and steady. Disengage from current position. Pivot 35 degrees south. Push along grid 4 alpha. You've got 30 seconds before the enemy locks your route. There was a pause, hesitation from officers who had dismissed her hours ago. But Stroud's eyes swept the room, and no one dared argue. Copy command, came the Marine reply. Units shifted south. On the monitors, the blue icons pulled clear of the ambush. Elara didn't wait. SEAL 2, hold breach until Marine 1 is inside the perimeter. Then strike from both flanks. You'll divide their fire and force withdrawal. Copy command. The simulated battlefield began to transform. Where red had overwhelmed blue, gaps appeared. Movements once chaotic became purposeful. She leaned closer to her screen. Marine 2, enemy is staged at Grid 6 Alpha. They're waiting for your commitment. Bypass north 50 meters, swing back once SEAL 2 makes entry. The reply came fast, crisp. Acknowledged, adjusting approach. On the monitors, enemy icons shifted, suddenly unsure. Their ambush net frayed. Elara's voice never rose. She didn't bark. She didn't grandstand. She issued commands like a chess master moving pieces across a board. Precise, inevitable. Air 3, eyes on the ridgeline. Spotter at Grid 5 Charlie. Neutralize or we lose ISR control. Seconds later, confirmation. Spotter down. The fog over the field cleared, both literally and tactically. In less than 10 minutes, the scoreboard began to change. Red losses slowed. Blue strength indicators rose. The operation that had been unraveling now moved with deadly rhythm. Marines advanced in sync with SEAL breaches. Air support flowed seamlessly into the gaps. What had been chaos looked like choreography. Around the command center, officers who had once smirked now stared in silence. Vance's confident swagger had evaporated. Rourke's hands clenched and unclenched on the table, each of Elara's calls reminding him of how wrong he had been. But Elara never glanced their way. She had no interest in their shame. Her focus was on the mission, on the men and women in the field who depended on clear guidance. What Elara demonstrated in those moments was not merely tactical genius, it was the power of quiet leadership, the kind that doesn't need volume to command. Too often, leadership is mistaken for noise. We assume the loudest voice carries the most authority. The sharpest tone means the greatest control. But real leadership, lasting leadership, is found in clarity, composure, and timing. Elara didn't need to dominate the room. She didn't need to win arguments during the briefing. She let results speak. And in the moment of crisis, her calm steadiness became the anchor everyone else clung to. History celebrates loud figures, generals with fiery speeches, CEOs who dominate boardrooms. But time and again, the ones who change outcomes are the quiet leaders. Think of Abraham Lincoln, whose soft voice and thoughtful pauses carried more conviction than any shout. Or Rosa Parks, who didn't raise her voice, but whose refusal to move spoke louder than an army. Quiet leadership works because it is rooted in discipline. In the storm, people do not seek volume. They seek calm. They follow the one who does not break under pressure. That was Elara. Back in the simulation, her influence reshaped the battlefield. Marine 3, she called, flanking element moving on your 6. 2 technicals, 4 minutes out. Establish overwatch on Grid 8 Delta. Copy establishing overwatch. Air 2, sweep compound exterior. Secondary structure looks hardened. Possible command node. Roger, confirmed hardened structure. Piece by piece, she dismantled the enemy's plan and rebuilt the operation into success. What had been a bloodbath became a clean, coordinated sweep. 10 minutes earlier, the room braced for humiliation. Now the scoreboard ticked steadily back toward green. When the final building was cleared, the command center erupted. Not in cheers, but in something heavier. Respect. The Marines and SEALs on the floor glanced at Elara with a mix of awe and unease. They had watched her turn disaster into textbook victory with nothing but calm commands. Admiral Stroud broke the silence. Operational insight that saves lives doesn't always come from the loudest voice in the room. Worth remembering. No one argued. Elara powered down her console with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything. She didn't bask in the silence, didn't savor vindication. She simply closed her notebook, slid the pen into place, and stood. Her work was done. The officers around her would never look at her the same again. But Elara didn't need their admiration. What mattered was that the mission succeeded, and that those who would have been lost had been given another chance. That is the quiet power of leadership, the kind that doesn't demand the spotlight, but earns it when it matters most. The scoreboard glowed green at last. On the monitors, blue icons marked Marines and SEALs sweeping the compound, coordinated and efficient. The final structures were cleared, comms returned to calm acknowledgments, and the simulation officially ended. For a long moment, no one in the command center spoke. The room that hours earlier had hummed with chatter, bravado, and dismissive jokes now sat in stillness. Officers shifted uneasily in their chairs, each grappling with the reality of what they had just witnessed. Lieutenant Commander Elara Whitmore remained at her console, hands folded neatly, posture steady. She didn't smile. She didn't bask in the victory. She simply began powering down systems, as though this had been nothing more than another day, another operation. The silence stretched until finally Captain Daniel Rourke stood. The Marine officer who had waved away her warnings, who had insisted tides and ambushes wouldn't matter, walked across the floor. His boots echoed too loudly in the quiet. He stopped in front of her, his jaw worked, words fighting against pride. At last, he forced them out. "Commander, I owe you an apology. I was wrong to dismiss you." Elara looked up at him, her expression unreadable, then gave the smallest of nods. "Noted, Captain." There was no gloating in her tone, no sharpness, only calm finality. A few seats down, Lieutenant Ethan Vance shifted, as if considering whether to add his own words, but none came. For men like him, silence was its own admission. Admiral Stroud stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of closure. "Experience isn't about noise, it's about results. And today you saw the difference." Every officer in that room knew he wasn't speaking only about Elara. He was speaking about the culture that had made them blind. The tendency to equate confidence with competence, volume with authority, swagger with leadership. Stroud's words cut through those illusions like steel. Elara gathered her notebook, sliding the pen neatly into place. She looked around the room, meeting eyes without challenge, only with a steady reminder. She had been here all along, waiting for them to listen. What lingered in that room was not embarrassment, but revelation. True respect is not granted by rank or demanded by voice. It is earned through consistent, undeniable action. Elara didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight to dominate the briefing. She didn't seek validation. Instead, she demonstrated the essence of quiet professionalism. Let results speak. In life, how often do we fall into the same trap as Vance and Rourke? We dismiss the quiet colleague in meetings, the soft-spoken classmate in group projects, the reserved worker whose ideas don't come wrapped in volume. Yet when crises come, when stakes are highest, it is often those very people who hold the insight that changes everything. Respect is not about who talks the most. It's about who makes the difference when it matters. History echoes this truth. Leaders like Dwight Eisenhower, whose calm planning won wars without theatrics. Scientists like Rosalind Franklin, whose quiet discoveries made DNA breakthroughs possible, though her name was overshadowed. Activists like Rosa Parks, who didn't shout but changed the world by sitting still. The room at Coronado learned that lesson the hard way. They had treated Elara like background noise, until she became the only frequency that mattered. As officers began to file out, conversations hushed, glances lingered on Elara. Some were thoughtful, some ashamed, others simply awed. None would forget what they had seen. The woman dismissed as intel support had saved the exercise and in doing so, exposed their own arrogance. Rourke paused at the doorway, turning back once more. His face carried the look of a man still struggling with humility, but also with newfound respect. Elara met his eyes briefly, then returned to her notebook. She didn't need his validation. She had her own. Admiral Stroud stood near the exit, arms folded, watching the officers disperse. His gaze settled on Elara one last time. A small nod passed between them, professional, silent, but heavy with meaning. And then, the room was empty. Elara remained a moment longer, the dim hum of machines her only company. She closed her notebook, tucked it under her arm, and walked out. No applause followed her, no cheers. but the silence she left behind was louder than any ovation, because silence in that room had transformed from dismissal into respect. The story of Lieutenant Commander Elara Whitmore is not just about a military exercise. It is a mirror reflecting something many of us see in daily life, but often ignore. How often have you sat in a meeting, a family discussion, or even a church gathering, and watched the loudest voice take over while the quiet one was pushed aside? How often have we mistaken confidence for competence, forgetting that wisdom often whispers instead of shouts? In America today, where voices compete louder than ever, on news channels, social media, and even our neighborhoods, it's easy to equate volume with truth. But Elara's lesson cuts through all of that. Real strength doesn't need to raise its voice. Results, integrity, and calm under pressure will always speak louder than ego. Think about the quiet nurse in a hospital ward who catches the detail that saves a life. The soft-spoken teacher who changes the direction of a child's future. The grandfather at the dinner table who doesn't argue politics, but tells one story that everyone remembers years later. Leadership, in the truest sense, is rarely about noise. It is about impact. And maybe that's the debate worth having here. Have we built a culture that rewards showmanship over substance? Are we too quick to dismiss those who don't demand attention? Or do we still recognize the power of those who work in silence until it matters most? I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever underestimated someone quiet, only to realize later they carried the answers all along? Or maybe you were that quiet person, dismissed at first, until your actions spoke for you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories add life to these touching stories. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so that more people can reflect on these lessons. Because in the end, as Elara showed us, the most powerful people in the room are not always the loudest. They're the ones who let their results speak for themselves.